Today on Questions, are we worshiping the wrong God? Hey everybody, welcome to Questions. If you're new here, this is a series where you have questions on faith, spirituality, religion, God, philosophy, theology, depth, meaning, basically what does it mean to be human? And we have answers, albeit probably unsatisfactory ones. And so let's dive into the question for today, which is kind of a doozy. Does the fusion of the Yahweh and Elohim tribal stories cause you pause? Why or why not? All right, so to answer this question, I'm going to give a little bit of a backstory to explain what the person who asked this question means when they talk about the Yahweh and the Elohim tribal stories, because it's probably not familiar with everyone. And so I'm going to get us all on the same page, and then I'll start talking about if it actually gives me pause or not. So this video might be a bit more academic, it might be a little bit more about history and facts than actual spirituality, but we get to a spirituality place later on. So bear with me if this isn't your thing. If this is your thing, you're welcome. Also, this might be a bit of a longer episode because there is just so much here. So on YouTube, no worries, this will all be one long video. On Instagram, this might have to be separated and split up into a few different videos. Hopefully not too long. We'll see. Well, yeah, let's dive into this idea. So first and foremost, the idea behind the fusion of the Elohim and the Yahweh tribal stories is that there is an idea put forth by scholars and archeologists and historians and linguists that the God of the Judeo-Christian scriptures is an integration of multiple different tribal stories, kind of multiple different cultural traditions, kind of coming together in the ancient and Middle and Near East. And it was only really put together as one true God much later down the road when Israel was actually forming as a nation and setting itself apart from kind of the nations around it. The idea is, if you look at history, there was several other gods who Israel then changed to be one God to fit their own religious purposes. But there's evidence that they stole and they integrated and they kind of mushed together other traditions that existed before them. So to give a little bit more history on that, the ancient Hebrew scriptures often call God two names mostly. There's the ancient Canaanite term Elohim, which is commonly used to mean just God, and it is based on a Semitic root word El, which just means strong one, and El is also a common phrase used for God. It's often used as a generic term for God throughout early civilizations in and around that area. A lot of different cultures had the term El and Elohim when talking about their gods in and around kind of Mesopotamia in that day and age. But it was also the proper name of a Canaanite high god. So the idea is that there is evidence that the Canaanite tradition of a high god named El and Elohim eventually integrated into the traditional Yahweh, and that they weren't always together as one god as sort of the scriptures would suggest. But it's not just Elohim who might have had origins in a different tribal tradition before being integrated into the Hebrew tradition. Yahweh also has, there's evidence and there's scholars who believe that Yahweh actually didn't originate with the Hebrews either, but first can be found recorded in with the Midianites or even the Kenites, both of whom were predating any formal Israelite, Hebrew, Jewish people. So this is kind of substantial because when we look at the Torah, when we read the story of Moses, who, tradition tells us was responsible for writing laws that would kind of become the formal religion of Judaism, the story tells us that after Moses ran away from Egypt, he ran to the land of Midian. He meets a man named Jethro, who is in fact a Kenite, and Moses marries Jethro's daughter, and we're told that Jethro is a Kenite priest. And so then Moses lives with this family and a bunch of Midianites for decades. So this is important because while it is never said what god Jethro is a priest of, coming from Midian, being a Kenite, historians and scholars and archaeologists would propose that he was a priest of Yahweh well before Yahweh was ever established as the God of Israel, because Yahweh is established as the God of Israel through Moses. And so this is further kind of shown when Moses meets God in a burning bush. He frees the people of Israel from Egypt, and they travel to Mount Sinai. And it says that Moses calls for Jethro to meet him there, and Jethro excitedly comes and joins them. And when Moses tells him the whole story of what all happened in Egypt, it says that Jethro praised God and offered burnt sacrifices to God. So there's no part where it says that Jethro turned away from his other god. There's no sign that Jethro wasn't okay with Moses following Yahweh. All of this kind of points to the fact that Jethro was already a priest of Yahweh, which some use as an explanation that Yahweh already existed and was already a traditional tribal god before Yahweh came to the Israelites. So there comes a point where a lot of scholars claim that the Hebrew tradition attempted to kind of merge all of these different traditions together, to take all these kind of separate gods from all these kind of mismatched people groups and kind of bring them into one kind of conglomerated, smooth, easy religion that they could all get on board with. They claim we can find evidence of that kind of creation when Moses meets the burning bush in Exodus 3, verses 14 through 15. And so I'm going to read the original words, and I'm going to use the original Hebrew when talking about God to kind of showcase what's happening here. So here's Exodus 3, 14 through 15. Elohim said to Moses, I am who I am, or Eyeh Asher Eyeh. And he said further, thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. Elohim also said to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the Elohe of your ancestors, the Elohe of Abraham, the Elohe of Isaac, and the Elohe of Jacob has sent me to you. So there you can see in just 2 verses, there have been 4 names for God, all different names for God. And some would argue that that is linking 4 different tribal traditions together into one new kind of converged religion. We have Elohim, we have Eyeh Asher Eyeh, we have Yahweh, and we have Elohe, which is just a variation of the Mesopotamian word El. So all of this is to say that there are a lot of names for God given throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and a lot of those names have long historical evidence as to being first found in other cultures and other traditions and being other independent, separate gods than the one God that is proclaimed by Judaism. So the reasoning for this conjoining, some archaeologists and scholars claim, is because historically the story of there being 12 tribes who are slaves in Egypt is actually not historically accurate. They claim that there was actually only evidence of 2 tribes being slaves in Egypt who eventually are freed, and they wander into the wilderness on their way to Canaan. And on their travels, they are then joined by the 10 other tribes, becoming the 12 tribes of Israel. But those 12 tribes, the 10 and the 2, come from separate traditions and places with their own histories and ideals and stories of their gods. And so to come together to form one separate independent nation that would become known as Israel, they had to conjoin all of their heritage, all of their traditions, all of their stories into one kind of congruent story. And they use as evidence of this as well that throughout all of the readings we have of the 12 tribes of Israel, there's often a sort of separation between the 10 and the 2, ending up in way later down in Israel's history when there is a separation between the 10 and the 2 tribes, where the 10 tribes form the northern country of Israel and the 2 tribes form the southern country of Judah, saying, you see, there was always this separation, there was always this division, they never fully integrated, and so it was easy for them to break apart amicably because there was always some cultural rift between them. And so to go along with that, they claim there's evidence even in scriptures themselves that claim that this was not supposed to be a monotheistic religion necessarily, but that there are 2 gods kind of working against each other and with each other and separate from each other. And this is evidence even in our Judeo-Christian scriptures today. So they claim, if you look at the book of Genesis with the creation story, there are 2 separate creation stories. And the first creation story talks about Elohim, and the second creation story talks about Yahweh. Then again, a few chapters later, when talking about Noah, there's 2 separate flood stories. Elohim comes to Noah and says, build an ark and have 2 by 2 animals. And then later, Yahweh comes to Noah and says, build an ark, there's going to be a flood. I want 7 pairs of animals, and also has distinctions between clean and unclean animals. And in those 2 stories, both the creation and the flood stories, there is a separation between Elohim and Yahweh. So all of this is to say that is kind of the claim, the history, the evidence, and the arguments used by many credited archaeologists, scholars, historians, linguists, many very smart, educated people who claim that Yahweh and Elohim are separate gods that were kind of mushed together by the many different traditions found within the Hebraic origins. So now to the second part of the question, does that give me pause? To which I say, sure, but does it stop me in any way? Not at all. And I'll talk about why for a few reasons. So the first reason is that there is a lot of scientific disagreement between everything I just said being actually factual and proven through artifacts and history. If this kind of stuff is your jam, if you are a history nerd, which I am, but if the way that you approach religion or faith or spirituality is through facts and science, I personally don't hook into those things when I'm dealing with my spirituality. But I know a lot of people who do, and so it's not to discredit this, but if the way that you have to interact with your faith is through science and fact, then this stuff is your jam, and this is something that you should really know and look into and be studied up on, because it's really important. You probably do know if this is your jam. You probably know that trying to accurately detail and figure out exactly how history went about and when that history went about is extremely difficult, especially the further back we go. Trying to figure out what happened thousands of years ago and what those events would have actually meant to the people living them, it's really, really hard. I mean, we're talking about like the rough start of human civilization in the Near East, trying to piece together artifacts found and how much truth is actually in the writings or in the evidence, and how much is just, creating folk tales off of their own stories, how to properly date those artifacts. It's extremely difficult, and people about 1 billion times smarter than I am don't agree exactly on how that all plays out. They don't agree with how the narration of history unfolded and when the events that they're trying to argue over actually unfolded. So it is very easy for archaeologists and scholars and all of these very, very smart people dealing with history to have like time frames for when events hypothetically took place. And those time frames can sometimes range from like 150 years or even more sometimes. So like when dealing with history, 150 years is kind of a small little segment. And yet, if we think about it with today, like how would you feel if like 6,000 years from now, archaeologists were like, yeah, there are these people living in like 2022 and they had this like civil war break out, fighting over whether they thought that people should be able to own slaves. And then like there's another archaeologist who was like, actually, I think that was more around like 1860 that it happened, and they had like an argument. Like it seems crazy to us today that anyone would confuse us with people living in 1860, and yet that's like 150 years. It's very tiny in the grand scheme of life. So when we're dealing with ancient history, there's a large margin of error, but that margin of error can be decades and lifetimes and more. So like the margin of error can be really great, and that margin of error can make or break fitting something into like the quote unquote like biblical truth and history or not. So there are a lot of very, very smart scientists who believe that everything I just said about how all these different traditions came together to form Elohim and Yahweh is actually completely wrong. And these people aren't like Christian scholars or religious scholars trying to prove, that the Bible is true. They're atheists who don't believe the Bible is true in terms of like there being an actual God, but believe that there are a lot of things that happen very factually accurately in Scripture. They believe that some of the stuff that is written in Genesis or Exodus or here or there actually went roughly according to the way it's written in the Bible. It's just the whole burning bush thing didn't actually happen. There are non-religious scholars who claim that there's evidence that the 12 tribes of Israel were actually slaves in Egypt altogether, and that they left altogether. There are non-religious scholars who believe that there's evidence that they have even found potentially Joseph's burial site along with his 11 brothers, because it is a burial site of a non-Egyptian man who was a high-ranking ruler in Egypt, and that fits with the biblical story. And again, these are people who don't believe that there was ever actually a supernatural God, but believe that some of the stuff that's told in the Bible is factually true. And that just goes to show again that there is just so many differing opinions and people who have the same amount of accreditation and the same amount of prestige in the history and archaeological world who disagree on this. They're equally qualified professionals who just simply see things differently. So there is evidence, and I don't think any scholar would actually disagree, that the term El or Elohim was used as a generic term for God that was spread throughout multiple tribes in that day and age, in that place, as well as also being a proper name given to certain traditions. But that is very much like how God is used today. When I say God, I could be talking about big God or little God. I could be talking about uppercase God or lowercase God, and yet it's all called God. God is a name, God is a title, God is a term. They're all one and the same and different and can be different. It's very similar to the fact that, like, in English, when we use the word God, when talking about God, we're using a word that is derived from a Germanic word that is Gott. And Gott was a Germanic animalistic goat god, worshipped by early Germanic pagans. So you can hear it in the word itself. God, Gott, goat. Does that mean that when anyone ever prays to God, they're actually secretly praying to a early paganistic Germanic goat god? No. We all kind of understand that, like, over time, language and words can change and shift, and the meaning of those words can change and shift over time. And so we cannot look at a word by itself, but what that word means through the context clues of that day and age. So does Elohim come from a Canaanite word that predates the Hebraic tradition? Is there a formal God called Elohim that came before the Elohim we read about in the Judeo-Christian scriptures? Sure, yes, technically, yeah. There's also a goat god that came and predates the English word for God. It doesn't mean that the goat god came before God. It doesn't mean that the goat god and the Judeo-Christian God are the same. It doesn't mean that the Canaanites' personal god Elohim is the same personal god for the Hebrews' more general name for God. So the last point I will make in terms of a scholarly, fact-based argument before I kind of move into a bit more spiritual is that when looking at the ancient Jewish scriptures themselves, in those scriptures, the scriptures themselves make room for a lot of evidence that God or Elohim or Yahweh didn't just appear to the Israelites. While scripture argues that the Israelites are God's chosen people, and we can have a field day arguing that and everything, it doesn't say that they're the only ones who know God. So Abram, or Abraham as he's known later in life, for all intents and purposes, was not Jewish. And so, like, you can say he was the father of Judaism, and, yes, that's a valid argument, but he didn't follow Hebraic law, the law of Moses. No matter what way you kind of look at it, the story of Abram is that God appears to a more or less kind of quote unquote random guy and tells Abram to follow him. And yes, Abram would then, have Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and create the nation of Israel. He's the patriarch of that family and that people group. But it's not impossible for God to have also made divine appointments with other people who were not part of the Jewish tradition. Like why would God only be revealed to one person? Yes, obviously God revealed himself to one person so that person could be the hero and the starting point of a long lineage of people. But why couldn't God be revealed to a bunch of other people so that they could also be the starting point of a long lineage of people who followed God? And like, before you claim that I'm a heretic, the canonized Judeo-Christian scriptures also kind of support this idea. The book of Job is thought to be like the oldest book in the Bible, the first written book. And while there is a lot of speculation if Job is an allegorical story or a factual one, and this is a debate that existed before Jesus was even born, it doesn't change the fact that in Jewish scripture, God is known by someone who is not a Jewish man, but by an Uzite, a man who lives in the land of Uz. So someone outside of the Jewish tradition knows and follows Elohim, and by the tradition that the scripture presents, it is not a generic Elohim. It is not some other god from another culture. It is the Jewish, Hebraic, Israelite god Elohim that Job is worshiping, and that is canon to how scriptures present it. And now again, you can say, well, that's allegorical, doesn't really matter. Fine. But similarly, when Abram is traveling around to find the land that God has told him to travel to, he meets a man named Melchizedek, a man who is described as both a king and a priest, but he worships El. And once again, this is a man outside of the Jewish tradition, mainly because the Jewish tradition doesn't really exist at this point, but he is also going to be in direct violation of Hebraic law, because he is both a king and a priest, which is strictly forbidden by the law of Moses. Something that, King Saul is going to find out about in a few books. But all the same, scripture is written to tell us that canonically, Melchizedek is worshiping the same God, even though Melchizedek is not a part of Israelites' story. So someone who is not Jewish, who is not Hebrew, who is not an Israelite, is worshiping the same God as we are, but was not part of the same lineage, the same tradition, the same heritage. And this again leads us to Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, who was a priest living in a land and of a people who were believed to have been the originators of the tradition of Yahweh. And so when Moses meets Yahweh and obeys Yahweh and then tells Jethro about what Yahweh did, Jethro praises Yahweh in a way that would suggest that Jethro was already a priest of Yahweh. And so while some use it as an argument that Yahweh comes from a different place than originating as a Hebraic tradition, the scriptures is giving space for God met with the people that Jethro was attached to in a separate way and brought them together as, again, the one God Give space to the idea that Jethro wasn't worshiping another Yahweh or another God of the same name, another being who also happened to be named Yahweh, but that Jethro was a priest. Jethro was worshiping the same God that if you follow God today, we worship. So all of that to say that by the structure of the scriptures themselves that we have in this Jewish and Christian canon, there is space for God to be outside of just dealing with the Jewish people and for it still to be God. There is a subtle narrative throughout a lot of the Old Testament that shows that there is room for multiple people to have known Elohim or Yahweh, and for those two names to be two names for the same God, one being, not a mashed together God that some claim it is. So the point of saying all of this is that, yes, this question, this idea gave me some pause, but the pause made me do a deep dive into this whole topic. And I read and I studied and I talked to friends and family members who know a lot more about this on that subject and who fall in many different places on the scale of what this means and what the truth is. And I looked at multiple sources and I read multiple sources, and specifically and purposefully, I looked at people who disagree with one another, but who hold the same level of credibility in an academic field. And I came to a conclusion that I myself decided was the one that worked for me. And at no point was that a roadblock for me following Jesus. But it was for me. So the main reason that this wasn't ever a roadblock for me is that I don't find a lot of meaning in my spirituality by focusing on the factualization of Scripture. I find it all super interesting, mainly because I'm just I'm a nerd for history and stuff like that. But my belief isn't set upon everything in Scripture having to be 100% fact. In fact, I've talked a lot about in a lot of different places and a lot of different videos that I don't believe the Bible to be 100% fact. I believe the Bible to be 100% true, but I don't need everything to happen 100% the way it's written in the book to have factually happened in history. And that doesn't mean that I think the whole Bible is just make-believe tales of moral code. That doesn't mean that. And I do believe in fact. And I'll talk about the distinction about fact and truth later, and how I can argue that I don't need Jonah to be a real live person or Noah to be a real live person, and why I can still say that King David and Jesus were, and why it's not a slippery slope that is going to lead to your damnation. We'll talk about all of that in another video. That's not for this video, but it's definitely a really good question and a really good thing to talk about. But that's the whole point, is I don't personally like getting hung up on trying to factually prove the existence of God. My faith doesn't require that. I would suggest for everyone to study this topic or topics like it for yourself. It is an important topic for all of us to know and to be knowledgeable on, only because your faith should be, to an extent, your own. It's your faith. We all follow the traditions given to us by our parents or our leaders or our friends or our family or someone who imparted an idea to us when we were growing and learning. But I really strongly believe that there comes a time when we have to figure out for ourselves, do I believe what I believe because someone else told me to believe it? Or do I believe what I believe because I have done the work and I actually believe this thing? Those beliefs should be nurtured and they should be helped, and we should find guidance and counsel and education in the community around us and with wisdom and knowledge from people around us. But it doesn't mean that we put our faith into someone else's hands. If we believe the traditions given to us 100%, and we can't allow for space for wiggle room or for outside opinions, if we hold on to the traditions given to us with an iron fist, then if we ever come across a differing opinion or something that might prove us wrong anyway, well then it shatters, it's ripped out of our hands, and it hurts us. It can cause disastrous emotional and mental or spiritual pain and anguish. The strongest metal is not the sturdiest, because if there's no give, it breaks. The strongest metal is one that can move a little bit when pushed upon. We need to hold on to the things we believe with a bit of an open palm a little bit, so that if it's proven wrong and it's grabbed out of our hands, well, we were ready for it to be grabbed out of our hands, and so that and we're not hurt by it, and we're ready to grab onto something new, something better. We often want to see our beliefs as white and black, but the best way to grow, the best way to learn, the best way to live that doesn't have our whole world collapse around us if a tiny little piece of our faith is proved wrong, is to live in this sort of gray space, this kind of in between. It's kind of always searching for something better while living with the best we have now, striving to grow deeper, striving to learn more, striving to understand the things that are written and the things that are found and the things that are proven more. I believe it's the philosopher and theologian Peter Rollins who talks about that the greatest thinkers or believers, the greatest people who are in movements are the ones who often have the most doubts of that movement, because in seeking to learn more, they uncover facts that might shed doubt on what they believed. It's the fundamentalists who are the least committed to their movement, because they don't want to learn more. They're happy with their ignorance. They know what they think they know, and they don't want anything to do with anything that might challenge that. And so they live with their tiny little fraction, with their tiny little piece, and they hold on to it really tightly, and they ignore any other thing that might say different, and they're never going to grow from there. But it's the people who are the most committed, who are willing to be challenged, and maybe that changes, and their beliefs change, and the things they think change, and they might find doubt, and they might find conflict, but it's all in the purpose of actually growing deeper in the thing, in the movement, in the tradition, in the spirituality that they believe in so strongly. And I believe that we have to live like that. We have to be willing to lose pieces of our tradition that we have come to understand just don't fit anymore, because what's waiting for us is something better. And clearly, everyone has their bias. I had my bias and my beliefs, my schools of thought that were given to me and I was raised in. And everyone's going to have that. You're never going to find a completely subjective human who's like, this is it. We all come with it, but striving to be as open as possible when researching, when studying, when trying to get deeper into something is so important, because everyone can then make an informed decision on what they truly believe. And it's something, it's a decision that can be changed again in the future when more information comes out. And so I can say with some confidence and some ease that, yeah, my opinions, my thoughts, my beliefs changed a little bit as I researched for this very video. The things I thought and believed when I went into this video kind of changed when I did some research. But at the same time, they didn't change in any substantial way that made me question my faith in Jesus in any real way. And I can say with some confidence that the thing I believe now would probably still anger both sides of this argument. I didn't move completely to one camp, and I'm not completely in the other camp. And I think that's the place to live. If you're not pissing off everyone, you're probably not doing it right. It's where I like to live. Just make everyone upset. That's the Jesus way. So in this video, I'm not going to tell you what I think or which side is right, which side is wrong, and put my flag in one camp or the other. I am going to tell you that I think you should do the work yourself. You can take the evidence that I shared. You can dive deeper. You can become more knowledgeable than even I am on the subject, and that's not hard to do. Your faith has to be your decision, just as my faith has to be mine. And even at the end of the day, if one side is proven factually right over the other side, I don't think either side's victory is going to shake up what I personally hold to be true, my faith, my beliefs. Only because the facts aren't what compel me to follow Jesus. It's the love that compels me. It's the passion for justice. It's the peace. It's the goodness. And that is something that will always be true. So that is what I have for you today. I hope this made sense. If you have further questions, you can always be reaching out to get clarification or to continue this conversation. Like I say in almost every video, the purpose of these videos is not to be the final word, but to be the first word. We're always seeking to kickstart a conversation, kickstart a dialogue, get your brain moving and thinking, so that you can begin to form your own opinions and your own ideas. If you have other questions that you would like to see us talk about, you can always be messaging us, always be reaching out, either on Instagram at the Co-Mutual, on YouTube here at Brennan Johnson. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much. Hope to get some more videos out soon. Cheers, everybody.